Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, where we bring you the latest news, issues, and changes happening in the energy sector. We are recording this on the morning of Thursday, the 7th of November. We plan to focus this episode just on the US and the Trump election victory. However, last night, Germany descended into political chaos as the coalition government collapsed, and a split in a budget row over cutting energy costs to companies and financial support for Ukraine. In this episode, we're going to bring you analysis of both events from the US and Germany and the impact these tumultuous events will have on the European energy sector. Let's start with Trump. It's been named the biggest comeback in US political history that Donald Trump will be named the 47th US president on the 20th of January next year. In his previous presidential term, we saw an increase in tariffs and trade wars with China. The question is, what will Trump's second stint in the White House have in store for the energy market? And helping me to answer that and to talk us through the implications here, I'm very happy to welcome Nadia Wiggen from Svelland Capital back to the podcast. Great to have you back, Nadia. How are you?
Very well, thank you. It's great to be back.
First of all, were you expecting a Trump victory here? Did any of this surprise you? What's happened this week?
I think overall the markets and Svelland Capital, we did expect that the polls were leaning or that the results would support Trump. Also, the Senate looks likely to go towards the Republicans. And the part that I think was the least certain was that the actual Congress would also go red. And that appears to be the case as well.
So, I mean,
red sweet.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it wasn't so close in the end after all.
No. And I think the main thing to remember is before Kamala got into the race, things were looking really bad for Biden. There was some momentum. And then Americans voted on the economy first and foremost. And the cost of living is very high. And it was quite a damning result in terms of how the Biden administration has done in the nearly 4 years they've been in power.
Absolutely. So in terms of energy, is a Trump administration a more attractive choice for the energy market versus Kamala Harris?
Well, first and foremost, I think American people wanted change. And what Trump did say in his victory speech is he referred to oil and gas as America's liquid gold. So he is clearly supportive of that industry and would like to increase production in that regard, although the U.S. is already at record oil production as of August, even under the Biden administration. But I think he has an understanding that it's good to have a plenitude of oil and gas and energy available to help the U.S. maintain a competitive advantage in production, and that includes not only services but also manufacturing.
And so what are the implications here, both in the short and medium term then, Nadia? I mean, obviously a stronger focus on LNG and gas and oil, of course, but we'll be talking mainly about LNG and gas today. So how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, so I mean, when we look at how the market initially reacted, it really seemed to take a bipolar view, that it's very positive towards oil and gas development, very negative towards renewables. So focusing on the oil and gas side, things that the market was concerned about with a potential Kamala win or a strong performance by the Democrats is that there would be more environmental costs attached towards developing oil and gas. So, for example, we had finally this Matterhorn pipeline open up, which then allowed more oil production in the Permian Basin because you would have more takeaway capacity of natural gas when you don't want to have flaring. When we look at what the Biden administration did for LNG, in January, they put out a halt on a new permitting for LNG development. That is something that we thought that would be probably proven to be temporary should Kamala and the Democrats win, but that's not obvious. In the case of Trump, we believe he wants to develop that more. So that should happen more quickly and more easily. in particular, there have been studies to show one by Cornell University that was arguing that it is more environmentally negative to actually produce American LNG because of all the methane emissions associated with that. So there was a concern that those additional costs and concern could could be passed on to the actual oil and gas producers. In the event that we've now had this Trump victory and a red victory, it's less likely that that would be passed on to the oil and gas producers, therefore bringing down their costs and making it more efficient for them to develop production further.
So full steam ahead for production. What does that mean for exports to, for example, to Europe?
Yeah, so in the short term, we have the U.S. capacity we have, right? It's not, Trump doesn't come into power until January, same with this Republican sweep. So when we look towards the winter, we have had some delays in terms of what was starting out. So Plaquemines, for example, that had its first cool down cargo in August, but it's still not up and running in full throttle. We've also had a delay in Golden Pass Terminal 1, which was expected, to be up and running already. And now that's looking like late next year, early 2026. I think he will absolutely try to push these things forward, but there can be actual technical problems on that level. But there is a lot more coming online as well. We have the second and third terminals of Golden Pass coming. And then so there are more expansions on the cards. So I think if we look at when Trump starts and when Trump finishes his next term as the 47th president, we should have much more development in natural gas in general and helped by these LNG terminals. And that's where I think if we look at the price of Henry Hub versus TTF, it's at a massive disconnect. Henry Hub this morning is at around $2.75 dollars per MMBTU, and TTF is at 12.9. So there is a lot of potential. That is not the cost of shipping being reflected in that difference. So there's a big potential to help ease that pain for Europe and bring down costs for us as we have a plethora of production. And we have seen that, in the Haynesville, there's been a curtailment of production because Henry Hub has been so low. And we want that plenitude. Trump wants that plenitude of natural gas available to really speed that U.S. economy along.
And to export that in plenitude, the huge volumes mainly to Europe, which will bring TTF prices down then. In maybe not so much in the short term, but in the medium term, we're talking 25, 26, 27 then, Nadia. Would that be correct?
Absolutely. But I think it is important to understand that the reason why Trump wants those exports to Europe is in his first presidency, he made it very clear to NATO and to the Germans that he did not like German dependency on Russian natural gas. He was very critical of the Nord Stream pipelines. And so he is a businessman. He wants to have those relationships. And I think he will try to use this competitive advantage that the U.S. has in terms of oil and gas production to really build alliances. This is what the Saudis have done historically, and this is what the U.S., I think, will do under Trump. So that's when he pulls Europe back towards the U.S. by providing that energy cheaply. What we saw with this halting of the permitting on LNG that the Biden administration did, it immediately was met with a response by Qatar that they are proceeding full speed ahead on developing their natural gas and LNG resources to supply Europe instead. Trump would much rather that the U.S. is that main partner.
Absolutely. I think that's going to become clear as we go through the administration then, Ada. But you also mentioned renewables. I mean, is it either or is it going to be both with Donald Trump, with the next administration, do you think?
In our view, it's going to be both. I mean, the cost of living crisis in America involves, there are criticisms of the oil price, which is not that high when we look on a historical level. on natural gas prices, on everything costs. And what we see is that US energy demand is growing, global energy demand is growing. And so the US needs to develop that electricity supply. Trump cited or mentioned Elon Musk also in his victory speech. And, Elon Musk is very dependent on electricity and energy. But Elon Musk is a pragmatist, even though, yes, he really has proven the success of electric vehicles, in creating a competitive US automaker in America, right? But he's still a pragmatist. So he believes in fossil fuels. And I think that this will be the approach that Trump absolutely takes going forward. I think the other thing also to think about, though, is in terms of foreign policy and what Trump thinks on that. So right now, when we look into winter, for example, we have Arctic LNG 2 out of Russia being sanctioned. Right, the U.S. has sanctioned production out of those terminals, and what we had is this summer we actually had 8 cargoes load. They couldn't find buyers. 4 of them are sitting in floating storage in Russia, and they don't really have the capacity. One is sitting off of the coast of Jordan and Egypt. And as we discussed on the podcast last time, Egypt has become a net importer, but everyone is scared to take in these cargoes because of these sanctions. So as a result, the market is expecting Russia to actually shut down Arctic 2 for the winter. Now, again, going back to the point that I just made, Trump doesn't want greater dependency on Russia. So I think it is also important to think about sanctions on that side. And of course, when we think about Iran and the developments that we've had there, in terms of the fact that Iran in September loaded 2.1 million barrels per day of crude oil, right? That's Norway's entire production in a month. And whereas we had a completely different story when Trump was in power last time. So it'll be interesting on how he sees the developments there. But of course, he doesn't want oil prices to go skyrocketing higher. So that's where he's very dependent on US production going forward, as well as how OPEC Plus responds to that and having the Saudis on board to replace any potential Iranian oil on that part.
And sanctions against Arctic LNG, you think they are very unlikely to be lifted then in such a scenario?
Yes, that is exactly.
And just as an aside, Nadia, you mentioned Elon Musk. Do you think, I know this is sort of speculative really, but do you think he would get some kind of position in a Trump administration?
Well, I mean, when Trump talks about it, it seems like he would. So maybe he will cut the red tape on that part. At least I think Trump likes his circle of friends, his circle of trust, be they officially or unofficially in terms of role. Right now, they are communicating a lot, and I think he's learning a lot from that. And this is where at Svelland Capital we found it very surprising that renewables traded down as much as they did yesterday on this Trump victory. The fact that yes, when we listen to Trump's speeches, he doesn't like wind. He especially doesn't like offshore wind. He's been more positive towards solar, but there's no reason, for that to have a direct impact on the sector, the renewable sector in Europe, because we have good companies, especially in the solar space, that are, profit making, dividend yielding companies, and they traded down off of this Trump victory when we absolutely need every source of power we can have in Europe. And when we look at what Trump is planning, what she is planning. We currently have, the MPC meeting in China and discussing what kind of policies they are going to have going forward. Both the U.S. and China are focused on infrastructure. Trump mentioned infrastructure yesterday in his victory speech. That requires commodities. That requires energy. And this is where that competitive advantage for both China and the U.S. to develop factories. Labor is more expensive in both of those countries than it was 10 years ago. So that competitive advantage can come from lower cost of energy, especially when we are trying to depend on AI to increase productivity. This is what Europe absolutely needs to develop, is that lower cost of energy and plenitude of energy to be more competitive, to be able to utilize AI to increase productivity as well.
Absolutely. And when you say the renewables, they traded down, you mean the share price of major renewable
Yes.
renewable companies rather than the actual electricity? Because I think
Yes,
just to clarify,
exactly.
yeah, absolutely, Nadia. But
Yes,
what
absolutely.
a big driver in the US has been the Inflation Reduction Act or the IRA. What's the outlook there? Do you think Trump will scrap this, or could that continue? I think a lot of companies in Europe, for example, have considered relocating to the US, where they will receive more subsidies, more financial support for setting up factories, infrastructure build there. But they may be a little bit, or may be starting to reconsider those moves. I mean, if it were to be scrapped.
Yeah. First of all, this is why the congressional result is so important, because the IRA really helped a lot of Republican states. And the IRA, it's a little bit like Obamacare. You know, Trump didn't like Obamacare, but you actually have to try to get everyone on board to pass something else. The same with the IRA. There will be a lot of Republican support for some of the for a lot of what the IRA did. Of course, it was overly inflationary, and that was the problem. Even though it was called the Inflation Reduction Act, yeah, it was overly inflationary. So those are the kinds of criticisms that Trump would probably focus on changing things up. But it's actually quite difficult to pass some of these kinds of things. He has a lot of priorities, and when we the way you started your question is you said, well, Europeans are looking at moving factories there, right? He wants to get rid of this loophole of having factories built in Mexico and have them built instead in the US. That's what he wants. He wants all these things to be built in the US. So I don't think he will try to limit the reasons or cut down the limits why a factory would move to the US instead of sitting in Europe or sitting in Asia. And so he will, it's not going to be, oh, I'm just cutting it day one at all. And this, again, I think is very important for people to recognize. It has been very helpful for a state like Texas. I mean, this is why Elon Musk lives in Texas, right?
For sure, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned China. Um, in his previous administration, there was, a trade war and tariffs established. What's the outlook for the next 4 years, Nadia, in terms of raising tariffs, a more protectionist U.S. What's your view here?
Yeah, I think when Trump used the word trade war the first time, it was a real shock. I mean, since the Clinton years, we've been all about free trade and bringing down barriers in the World Trade Organization. And then Trump really changed that dialogue. Since the Trump administration, Biden hasn't pulled back these tariffs on China, and he has added to them. And even Kamala was talking about targeted tariffs. So I think the impact on the market should be less in terms of shock. It will come down to individual effects, right? Right now, he's talking about 10% tariffs on Europe. Some economists say the effect would really come at minimum 20%. I mean, we'll have to see how things start to develop, and there can be, of course, negotiations on these points, because, of course, he wants to maintain a competitive trade balance, right? And this is, I think, importantly when we think about China, is that if the US is currently the world's largest oil and gas producer, which Trump wants to maintain. China is a major importer of oil and natural gas, right? LNG prices are as high as they are because we've had record imports of LNG into China month over month over month. And that is partly driven or largely driven by the conversion of the trucking sector to run on LNG as well, right? So if he wants to improve the trade balance, it makes sense that he will encourage that relationship in terms of imports, right? And at the same time, when we think about his type of foreign policy, he'd probably like to discourage China from importing Iranian oil, right? Buy American instead. He might have to take an approach of, okay, I won't tariff you as hard on something if you use US crude oil instead of Iranian crude oil, for example. So I think we will have to be very specific in terms of the reactions. We will probably create more volatility in the market at times because he, of course, likes to be a deal maker and a big mover, and he doesn't like bureaucracy and having things take months and months and months.
And he's also quite unpredictable as well. Throw that into the mix. Yeah.
It is, yeah, well, I think that as we have one investor that likes to say, that in Europe, the problem was with Trump one is we didn't take him seriously and we took him overly literally. And we have to take him seriously and think about what he is actually doing. At least he is a frequent communicator, so it's not completely hidden what he's up to.
But what sectors specifically could be hit in Europe by the kind of tariffs or a trade war even?
Well, I mean, it's of course manufacturing. The big question is about the car industry, but I don't really think that his tariffs are going to hit Germany more so. Germany is really suffering, in our view, from an identity crisis in the car sector and competition from China. That is the number one problem for Germany. So it's not really the American competition that is destroying things. So that would be less impactful in that regard. And ultimately, as I've said, he wants to have more exports of natural gas, LNG, in a predictable fashion over to Europe. So that should help in the medium term. But of course, day one, it's not going to make as much of a difference as Europe could appreciate.
Absolutely. And Nadia, just a final question. You mentioned day one. What do you think? What are we gonna see from Donald Trump in his first weeks or months of taking office?
Well, I think he will really be focusing on America, and making America great again. So it will be focusing on improving things in terms of costs and trying to bring down inflation. It'll be interesting what the central bank does ahead of that in the US, in terms of cutting interest rates and creating that easier environment. But I think he will be number one focused on the US and having the US be competitive. And open competition is a good thing. That's what makes the world work well. And, we just have to be prepared in Europe with our companies and put our first foot forward.
Excellent, Nadia. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. Obviously, we'll have to invite you back soon or next year, even when we have more, when we see more what the Trump administration is all about, and then we can have some reactive views on outlook going forward. But once again, thank you very much for being a guest on the Montel Weekly podcast.
Thank you.
Now, listeners, we're moving on from the discussion about Donald Trump and what the administration means for the energy markets to Germany, where the government collapsed late on Wednesday for a number of reasons. Disagreement over the budget, disagreements about how to cut costs for industry, but also funding for Ukraine. Now, we're very lucky to have Tobias Federico with us. He's now currently at Munich train station. He was in the thick of things on Wednesday evening when it all kind of dissolved. Tobias, a warm welcome to you, and thank you for finding time to explain to us what's happening in Germany.
Thank you, Richard. It's always a welcome to be here.
So tell us what's happening in Germany. What's this chaos? What was the reasons behind the government collapse?
Well, it's interesting. I think there are many reasons. We can speak about it in detail. Yesterday, I summarized it a bit towards an auditorium where I said, well, the German government was able to handle crisis, but they were not able to govern. And I think the main reason is that when it comes to governing things, every party wanted to achieve their own ideas, and finding consensus was always a challenge. But in the end, I think the main reason is the money. We just realized recently that all the plans the government had were before the war and before high interest rate and before high inflation. And they see now that they cannot achieve all their goals in the first step, especially energy related, but all the other spending which were together, as you mentioned, also with the Ukraine regarding the war part. The second thing is really that, of course, when it comes to money, we already see or saw until yesterday, now we see it even more, the shadow of the potential elections in 1 year. So not the new one we will have, but the one which are regularly from 1 year going on. So in the end, it was about the money and disagreeing on how to spend the money and where does the money come from.
But this was not a fresh disagreement, was it? This has been ongoing within the government for at least a couple of years.
Well, yeah, it is, but of course it really piles up. And that has something to do with energy prices and with the economic growth, and also how to support the energy market. I mean, there are several points coming together because currently they're speaking about the budget for next year. And they just realized that since a few years, the subsidies for the feed-in tariffs are paid by the government, by the tax income. And they have been planning to spend 7 billion euros last year, and it will be 17 this year, so 10 billion euros more, because wholesale electricity prices have been decreasing and the gap between the feed-in tariff and the value of fluctuating renewables on the market became bigger. That was expected and used to be paid by the end user. Now it's paid by the government. That is one thing. The other thing is that they're really struggling and they're seeing that the tax income and the economic growth is decreasing due to high energy costs. That's not only wholesale prices, but it is also connected to grid fees and grid tariffs, and how to handle those, how to support the industry, how to achieve economic growth, plus renewable targets that have accumulated yesterday with some personal issues I get.
So it's quite a financial mess, I think it'd be fair to say there, in terms of, no money to pay for much higher costs. But what happens next, Tobias?
Ooh, that's the big question. And we only can guess a lot of things. And of course, there are some obvious things. First of all, we have a minority government right now, which means that if they want to make law decisions, they must find an additional partner. They need to find it within the CDU, which means that the CDU already has the potential to govern a bit with some laws. They will not find it in the FDP anymore, so in the Liberals, because the disagreement was too big. And they will definitely work together with the right-wing party, the AfD. And so that is one thing. So the question is, if the German government comes to a halt now, that's really frozen and it's a freeze, because we cannot govern at all. What is really interesting, usually in such a situation, the chancellor says that he is questioning himself. We call it in German Vertrauensfrage. And he wants to do that, but he will do that in January, the 15th of January, which is quite long. And I bet, and I'm not sure, but that's why I'm betting, it has something to do with the budget planning. So they need to finalize the budget. Without the budget for next year, we would have complete chaos. And they're planning re-elections on the 15th of March. So I think there will be no support from the other parties for Olaf Scholz, that he might questioning himself. So having the Vertrauensfrage already this year to have much earlier re-elections.
No, it's fascinating. And when we were just talking before we started recording, Tobias, you were mentioning that the situation here is more akin to an Italian situation. I know you also have Italian roots, and rather than a German, but I think it seems that the government in Rome is much more stable and provides more certainty than the German one, and that's quite a change of situation, change of affairs, I would say.
Well, I think it started with Volkswagen a few years ago when they had the diesel fraud, the fraud with the emissions, um, where Italian friends of me said, well, you Germans become more Italian and we Italians become more German. And if you look into that, they have economic growth, they have a punctual train system, and they have a stable government. And here in Germany, it seems that we have complete chaos. No, but it's on a different level, honestly. And yes, it's a bit like in Italy, and it's the fourth time that the chancellor is questioning really his position, and it's something which increases the insecurity in the whole German government system. Yesterday we had a very interesting day. It already started with the 900 or 800 euro we saw on the spot market due to a missing wind production. And when a day starts like this, a situation we never saw, then we had the Trump news, and then we had the German government news. I think the 5th of November will become one of the German days of history, which we will remember in the next 5 to 10 years.
It was a proper triple whammy, wasn't it? I mean, those kind of prices for 1 hour evening, Germany was burning oil, 700 megawatts of oil. I mean, in 2024, it kind of beggars belief. But I think, in terms of, I know that maybe the listeners there's some background noise, Tobias. That's because you're at the train station in Munich, so that's absolutely understandable. But again, it impresses upon us the urgency they have and the timeliness of what's occurred in Germany. It's just literally fresh off the press. But what are the implications of the government collapse for energy and for energy, sort of maybe in the short and medium term?
Mm-hmm. Well, what's quite interesting at Olaf Scholz's speech yesterday, he was mentioning energy prices and grid tariffs as first point of disagreement. And that was interesting. So this government collapsed on energy, more or less. It's now quite interesting because in the last years regarding energy, there was one word which was quite often used where we said, well, we are quite limited to technologies. We want to fluctuating new green technologies, and it should be green hydrogen. And any type of fossil fuels has been limited, any type of additional support. Nuclear energy at all was stopped and banned, and we've shut down all nuclear power plants. And now it's quite likely that the CDU might become the leading party for a new election. And what we see now, and I think this will be quite interesting, that we will open up much more towards other energy technologies, which means that I think carbon capture and storage will become an issue. The current government already was planning that, but for non-fossil fuels, which is a bit weird for my opinion, but nonetheless. So carbon capture and storage for fossil power plant, fossil fuels might be an option. I think there is a door open for nuclear energy, even though I think it's very unlikely that we will have any type of nuclear power plants in the German market, but the discussion will definitely go on. What is maybe a bit of a downside that we started discussion regarding a capacity strategy / market mechanism. The current government wanted to implement that. They wanted to make a bidding system for backup capacities supporting the energy-only market in case of a missing capacities, as we saw yesterday. And so that they financially want to support those. For me, it's a big question mark. First, where does the money come from? And secondly, will it be still achievable? There are no official statement from the government right now, of course. But I really bet that this might become an issue. I think it's also quite likely that we will phase or stop the phase out of coal power plants, at least for a while, because we really see that new capacities are not coming into the system. And I think it could quite likely also be that we take some of the winter reserves back again to the market. It's a bit of a rewinding, but I think the new government and the fear is there that in the short and midterm, we might run into a capacity crunch, I would call it, not really a blackout. So therefore, it's really interesting. Looking into what is happening on the other side of the channel, I think one answer could be to increase the European Union and the European energy market by increasing cross-border capacities. But that's nothing the government can really do. That's much more on my wish list. Yeah? But there are some significant changes going forward. And again, we are opening chapters we thought we would have closed.
I mean, it's fascinating now that maybe nuclear back on the table in Germany. That's quite a departure from anything we've seen over the 3-4 years. Even just that it's back on the table and being discussed is fairly radical.
It is definitely. I mean, it's not likely that it will come, but I think speaking about being technologically open means that every technology is on the table again. Every technology, and which, if you would have asked me 1 week ago, I would have said, no, nuclear would never come back. And maybe it's quite right that nuclear would not come back, but we see that worldwide, that nuclear is on a moving forward. We see this in France with the SMR, the small nuclear power plants. It will not be an option for Germany, but we will speak about it and we will discuss this quite strongly. So a bit of a rewind of this distributed renewable energy green transition backward to a much more centralized energy transition.
Yep, and it's you alluded to it as well, Tobias. But now we've seen obviously the President Trump winning the election, and he wants to export lots of gas, or he probably is likely to export lots of gas to Germany, and maybe that's going to happen. I mean, Germany will welcome that kind of those kind of deliveries of those kind of gas supplies in order to strengthen security of energy supplies going forward.
Definitely, but Trump is a businessman, and we have to pay a price for that. And the price will be the market price. Market price plus a premium. I don't know, but in the end, natural gas will become the so-called bridge technology as expected. And maybe also as a first step to fill up our planned hydrogen grid, what we will have in Germany, not with green hydrogen, but rather with hydrogen out of methane. So I think it's a bit of a rewind of this green transition, but still, and I think this is common sense among every political party, we want to become climate neutral.
Tobias, fantastic that we managed to get hold of you. Thank you for all your fantastic insights into what's happening in Germany. We wait with bated breath to see what happens in the weeks and the months to come. But in the meantime, a safe journey back to Berlin.
Thank you, Richard, and it will be definitely exciting, and hope to hear you again soon.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tobias.